Jesse's paint horse, Dust Devil, shifted nervously beneath him, ears flicking at sounds only animals could hear. The mare had carried him through 3 counties without so much as a sidestep, but now she danced like a colt seeing its first rattlesnake. Jesse patted her neck, feeling the tremor in his own hand. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though his voice cracked on the words. The mansion loomed before them, defying every story he'd ever heard around Copper Falls dinner tables. Its black shutters hung straight and true, no char marks scarring the elaborate stonework. Ivy climbed the walls in perfect spirals, as if tended by invisible gardeners. Even the wrought-iron gate stood open, welcoming as a Sunday church door. Jesse had grown up hearing about the Blackwood Fire from every old-timer in town, how the whole place went up like a matchstick palace in 1937, how the screams could be heard clear to Main Street, how nothing remained but a foundation full of ash and bad memories. His own grandfather had helped fight that blaze, came home with singed eyebrows and stories that gave Jesse nightmares for weeks. Yet here stood 3 stories of impossibility, windows gleaming like watching eyes. The drought had driven him this far into the backcountry, following his grandfather's rambling tales about hidden springs in Devil's Canyon. Their ranch was dying by degrees. Cattle clustered around empty watering holes, pastures turned to dust bowls, and his mother's worry lines deepening with each cloudless dawn. At 12, Jesse was old enough to know that if they didn't find water soon, they'd lose everything his father had worked to build. His father, Sheriff Tom Caldwell, dead these 10 years come autumn. Jesse touched the faded photograph in his shirt pocket, the one where his father stood tall in his uniform, badge glinting like a promise. Everyone said Tom died trying to stop cattle rustlers out by Widow's Creek. A hero's death, they called it, quick and clean, defending what was right. Jesse had been too young to remember much of that night, just his mother's keening wail and how the house felt cold for months after. But he'd built his whole sense of right and wrong around his father's memory, around the idea that some men were willing to die for justice. Now, staring at a mansion that shouldn't exist, Jesse felt the first hairline crack in the foundation of everything he thought he knew. Dust Devil snorted and backed up a step. Jesse loosened the reins, letting her retreat to the tree line where she felt safer. He could walk the last 100 yards. Had to, really. The spring his grandfather mentioned was supposed to be somewhere behind the mansion, fed by an underground creek that never ran dry. His family needed that water. Their future depended on it. Jesse dismounted and ground-tied Dust Devil to a gnarled pine. The mare's dark eyes seemed to plead with him not to go, but Jesse had inherited more than just his father's strong jaw and stubborn streak. He'd inherited the Caldwell sense of duty, the bone-deep need to do what had to be done, even when fear tried to root his boots to the ground. The mansion's front door stood slightly ajar. Jesse approached on foot, his boots crunching on gravel that should have been choked with 50 years of weeds. Someone, or something, had been maintaining this place. The flower beds showed fresh-turned soil. The brass door handle gleamed like it had been polished that morning. Through the gap in the doorway, Jesse caught a glimpse of burgundy wallpaper and gleaming hardwood floors. A grandfather clock ticked somewhere in the depths of the house, counting off seconds that felt too loud in the mountain silence. He pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The air hit him like a wall, not musty or stale as he'd expected, but heavy with the scent of leather and old tobacco, as if the previous occupants had just stepped out for a walk. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that streamed through tall windows, and somewhere upstairs, floorboards creaked in a rhythm that sounded almost like footsteps. Jesse's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself forward. The water source lay beyond this house, and his family's survival trumped his fear. He'd find the spring, fill his canteens, and ride home with news that might save the ranch. As he crossed the foyer, heading toward what looked like a back hallway, something glinted beneath a loose floorboard near the massive stone fireplace. The wood had warped just enough to create a gap, and whatever lay hidden underneath caught the afternoon light like a mirror. Jesse knelt and worked his fingers under the board. It lifted easily, as if it had been pried up many times before. What he found in that dusty hollow would haunt him for the rest of his life. A sheriff's badge, tarnished and stained with something dark that might have been blood. And beneath it, a bundle of photographs tied with string. The badge bore a name etched in weathered metal, Sheriff Tom Caldwell. Jesse's hands shook as he held his father's badge, the metal cold against his palm, despite the afternoon heat. The dark stains had turned rusty brown with age, and Jesse didn't want to think about what they might be. He'd seen enough injured cattle to recognize dried blood when he saw it. But it was impossible. His father's badge had been buried with him 10 years ago. Jesse remembered standing at the graveside in his only good shirt, watching the flag-draped coffin disappear into Montana soil. The whole town had turned out, merchants closing their shops, ranchers riding in from miles away, even old Mrs. Henderson from the schoolhouse wiping tears with her lace handkerchief. The photographs beneath the badge were tied with butcher's twine that crumbled at his touch. Jesse's hands trembled as he spread them across the dusty floor, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The first photograph showed his father standing in what looked like this very parlor, though the furniture was arranged differently. Tom Caldwell wore his sheriff's uniform, but his face carried an expression Jesse had never seen before, grim, almost frightened. Around him stood 5 men in expensive suits, their faces sharp with shadows cast by oil lamps. Jesse recognized them all. Mayor Hutchins, though his hair was darker and his belly smaller. Doc Morrison, holding what looked like an old leather journal. Ben Cartwright, who owned the general store and half the buildings on Main Street. Samuel Pierce, whose family had founded Copper Falls and still controlled the largest ranch in the county. And most shocking of all, Judge Harrison, the man who delivered the eulogy at his father's funeral, calling Tom Caldwell a pillar of righteousness in our community. The second photograph made Jesse's blood turn cold. The same men, but this time they surrounded what looked like an open grave. Wooden boxes lay scattered nearby, and Pierce held a shovel caked with dark earth. His father stood apart from the group, his badge catching the camera's flash. His face turned away, as if he couldn't bear to look at whatever lay in that hole. Jesse sank back on his heels, his mind reeling. The drought, the failing ranch, even finding this impossible mansion, none of that mattered now. Everything he thought he knew about his father's death was crumbling like old newspaper. The official story had been so clean, so heroic. Rustlers had been hitting ranches throughout the county, and Sheriff Tom Caldwell had tracked them to Widow's Creek. There had been a gunfight at dawn. Tom had killed 2 of the thieves but died from his wounds before help could arrive. The surviving rustlers had escaped with nothing, and Tom's body was found by a search party 3 days later. Jesse had grown up proud of that story. In the schoolyard, when Tommy Morrison bragged about his father delivering babies, or when Sarah Pierce talked about her family's important business meetings. Jesse could always counter with how his father had died protecting the whole county from thieves. It made losing him hurt a little less, knowing Tom Caldwell had been a real hero. But heroes didn't hide their badges under mansion floorboards. Heroes didn't pose for secret photographs with men who looked like they were burying more than just treasure. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times, echoing through the preserved parlor. Jesse suddenly remembered why he'd come. The spring, the water his family desperately needed. His mother would be watching the horizon soon, worry creasing her face the way it did every time he rode out alone. She'd already lost a husband to the dangers lurking in Montana's wild places. Jesse couldn't imagine what it would do to her if she lost her son, too. But he couldn't leave. Not yet. He gathered the photographs carefully, his mind racing through memories of the past 10 years, how the town's wealthy families had rallied around his mother after the funeral, bringing casseroles and offering help with the ranch, how Judge Harrison had made sure the bank didn't foreclose when they couldn't make payments, how Mayor Hutchins always asked about Jesse's schooling, nodding approvingly when Jesse talked about maybe becoming a lawman like his father, all of them acting like such good friends, such caring neighbors, such pillars of the community. Jesse slipped the photographs into his shirt pocket next to the old picture of his father. The badge felt heavier than it should as he wrapped it in his bandana. Outside, Dust Devil nickered nervously, as if sensing her rider's distress. The floorboards settled back into place with barely a whisper, hiding the hollow that had guarded its secrets for a decade. But Jesse carried those secrets now, along with questions that gnawed at his chest like hunger. As he stood, a shadow passed by one of the upstairs windows, tall, wearing what might have been a hat. Jesse's breath caught, but when he looked again, the window was empty. He needed to find that spring and get home. His family's survival still depended on water, even if everything else he'd believed about their life was turning out to be built on lies. Jesse forced himself to look away from the empty window and head toward the back of the mansion. The spring was all that mattered now, had to be all that mattered. His family's cattle wouldn't survive another week without water, and whatever secrets this place held could wait until after he'd saved the ranch. The back hallway led through a kitchen that looked like it had been abandoned mid-meal. A cast-iron pot sat on the wood stove, its contents long since turned to dust. China plates waited on a scrubbed pine table, and Jesse could swear he smelled the ghost of fresh bread lingering in the air. His boots echoed on spotless floors that shouldn't exist after 50 years of neglect. Through the kitchen window, he spotted what he'd been hoping for, a stone well house tucked against the canyon wall, fed by a spring that bubbled up from deep underground. Water darkened the rocks around it, and Jesse could hear the musical trickle even through the glass. Relief flooded through him so powerfully his knees nearly buckled. But as he reached for the back door, boots thundered on the mansion's front porch. Jesse's blood turned to ice water. He pressed himself against the kitchen wall, heart hammering as voices carried through the house. "Told you someone was sniffing around." Mayor Hutchins' voice, though 20 years older than in the photographs. "Mrs. Peterson saw a boy riding toward Devil's Canyon this morning. Could be anybody." Judge Harrison sounded tired, irritated. "Kids explore. Doesn't mean what?" A third voice cut in, sharp with authority. "Ben Cartwright." "That someone might find what we've been protecting all these years? We've been careless, keeping our meetings here. Should have burned this place down for real decades ago." Jesse's mouth went dry. They were talking about the mansion, about meetings, about protecting something. His hand instinctively moved to his shirt pocket, where the photographs crinkled softly against his chest. Heavy footsteps crossed the foyer, heading straight for the parlor. Jesse looked frantically around the kitchen, but there was nowhere to hide. If he bolted for the back door, they'd hear him for sure. If he stayed, they'd find him the moment they searched the house. "The floorboard's been disturbed," Harrison's voice carried clearly now, cold as January wind. "Someone's been in the cache." Silence fell like a physical weight. Jesse could practically feel their shock radiating through the walls. "Impossible," Cartwright breathed. "Nobody knows about—" "Somebody does now." Hutchins's voice had turned deadly quiet. "Question is, who? And how much did they take?" Jesse's throat closed up. They knew. Somehow they knew he'd found the badge and photographs. His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the floorboard hadn't settled quite right, or maybe dust patterns had given him away. It didn't matter how they knew. What mattered was that 3 of the most powerful men in Copper Falls were standing between him and the only way out. "We need to search this place top to bottom," Harrison said. "If someone's here, we find them. If they've already left—" His voice trailed off, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. "What about the Caldwell boy?" Cartwright asked suddenly. "Tom's kid. He's about the right age to go exploring, and his family's ranch borders this section." Jesse's blood turned to slush. They were talking about him specifically now, and the way Cartwright said his father's name, casual, knowing, made Jesse's stomach clench with sick realization. Jesse Hutchins sounded thoughtful. He's been asking questions lately about his father. Sarah mentioned he's been pestering her about what she remembers from that night. "Maybe it's time for another accident," Harrison said quietly. "Cattle ranch is a dangerous place. Lots of ways a boy could get hurt." The words hit Jesse like a physical blow. They were talking about killing him. These men, pillars of the community, trusted leaders, the same people who'd brought casseroles to his mother and praised his father's memory, were calmly discussing murder, just like they'd murdered his father. The certainty hit him with crystal clarity. The rustler story was a lie. These men had killed Tom Caldwell, probably because he'd discovered whatever secret they were protecting, and now they were ready to kill his son, too. Footsteps started toward the back of the house. Jesse didn't hesitate. He eased the kitchen door open, just wide enough to slip through, wincing as the hinges gave the softest protest. The stone well house was 50 yards away across open ground, but beyond it lay thick timber that would hide his retreat to where Dust Devil waited. Behind him, a floorboard creaked as someone entered the kitchen. Jesse ran. He burst from the door at full sprint, boots pounding against hard-packed earth. Shouts erupted behind him, but Jesse didn't look back. The well house flashed past, precious water forgotten in his desperation to reach the trees. There, by the spring. A gunshot cracked across the canyon, the bullet whining off rock somewhere to Jesse's left. He zigzagged like a spooked rabbit, the way his father had taught him during their hunting trips. Another shot, closer this time. Jesse dove into the tree line just as a third bullet splintered bark inches from his head. Jesse crashed through the underbrush, branches tearing at his clothes as he stumbled toward where he'd left Dust Devil. His lungs burned with each ragged breath, and behind him he could hear voices shouting orders, organizing a search. The mare whinnied when she saw him, ears pinned back in alarm at the gunshot still echoing off the canyon walls. "Easy, girl," Jesse gasped, fumbling with the reins. His hands shook so badly he could barely untie the lead rope. "We gotta go. We gotta—" Another shot rang out, closer now. Jesse swung into the saddle and kicked Dust Devil into a gallop, not caring about the noise anymore. They needed distance, needed to get back to familiar ground where he could think clearly about what he'd learned. But as the mansion fell behind them and the immediate danger faded, Jesse's initial terror began crystallizing into something worse, paralyzing doubt. He reined Dust Devil to a trot, then finally to a walk as they climbed the familiar trail toward home. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, painting everything in shades of gold that should have been beautiful. Instead, Jesse felt like he was seeing the world through dirty glass, everything tainted by what he now knew. Those men had killed his father. He was certain of it now. But what was he supposed to do with that certainty? Jesse pulled out one of the photographs, studying the faces of the men he'd known his entire life. Mayor Hutchins had taught him to whittle when he was 7, patiently showing him how to follow the grain of the wood. Judge Harrison had presided over the church social last spring, leading the community in prayer before the barn dance. These weren't monsters from some dime novel. They were real people, complicated people who'd shown him genuine kindness over the years. The weight of that kindness pressed down on his chest like a stone. How could he reconcile the man who'd slipped him extra penny candy with the voice that had casually discussed arranging his death? How could the same hands that had helped his mother with her garden have pulled the trigger that killed his father? And what about the rest of the town? Jesse thought about Sheriff Coleman, who'd taken over after his father died. Was he part of this conspiracy, or just another dupe like Jesse had been? What about Doc Morrison, or the school teacher, or any of the dozen other adults who'd shaped his understanding of right and wrong? If he couldn't trust the pillars of his community, who could he trust? The photographs felt like they were burning a hole in his pocket, but Jesse found himself reluctant to look at them again. Part of him wanted to turn around, ride back to the mansion, and slip them back under the floorboard, where they'd been hidden for 10 years. He could pretend he'd never found them, never learned the truth about his father's death. He could go on believing the comfortable lie that had sustained him through childhood. Because what was the alternative? Tell his mother that her husband's death had been a lie? Destroy her faith in the community that had supported them through their darkest hours? Watch her world crumble the way his own was crumbling right now? Jesse thought about his mother's face when the bank had threatened foreclosure 3 years ago, and how it had transformed with relief when Judge Harrison intervened. He remembered her tears of gratitude when Mayor Hutchins had arranged for the church to help with their winter expenses. These men had been their lifeline, their protection against a world that could be harsh to a widow and her son. If Jesse exposed them, what would happen to his family then? And beyond that loomed an even more terrifying question: what if he was wrong? What if there was some explanation for the photographs that he couldn't see? What if his father really had been involved in something shameful, something that justified keeping it secret? Jesse had built his entire sense of identity around Tom Caldwell's heroism. What if that heroism had been the real lie all along? The sun was sinking toward the mountains now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Jesse could see the lights of their ranch house in the distance, warm and welcoming against the gathering dusk. His mother would be starting dinner soon, probably watching the horizon for his return. She'd ask about the water source, about whether he'd found anything that might save their cattle. He'd found something, all right, but not what either of them had hoped for. Jesse touched his father's badge through the bandana, feeling its weight like a physical burden. Tomorrow he'd have to decide whether to carry that burden alone or share it with the one person who deserved the truth, even if that truth destroyed everything they'd built together. For tonight, though, Jesse just wanted to go home and pretend that the world still made sense. Jesse guided Dust Devil down the familiar path toward home, but with each step, the warm glow of the ranch house windows seemed to mock him. That light represented everything he was about to lose: the comfort of ignorance, the safety of belonging, the simple faith that good and evil were clearly divided lines in the sand. His mother appeared on the porch as he approached, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. "Jesse, thank goodness." "I was starting to worry." Her smile faltered as she took in his torn shirt and the hollow look in his eyes. "What happened? Did you find the spring?" Jesse dismounted slowly, his legs unsteady. The spring. In his desperate flight, he'd abandoned the very thing his family needed to survive, but that seemed insignificant now compared to the weight of his father's badge pressing against his ribs. "I found it, Ma. The lie came easier than it should have. Good flow, clean water. I'll take the cattle out there tomorrow." Relief flooded her face, and Jesse felt something twist in his chest. Another lie built on top of lies, just like everything else in their lives. How many more would he have to tell to protect her? How many more could he tell before he became just another part of Copper Falls's foundation of deception? "Come eat," she said, linking her arm through his. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Jesse almost laughed at that. Ghosts would have been easier to understand than living men who wore masks of respectability while planning murder over dinner conversations. Inside the small kitchen, his mother ladled stew into chipped bowls, chattering about the neighbors and local gossip. Jesse tried to listen, but every mention of the town's leading citizens made his stomach clench. When she praised Mayor Hutchins for organizing the church charity drive, Jesse had to grip his spoon to keep his hands from shaking. "You're awfully quiet tonight," she observed, settling into her chair across from him. "Something troubling you?" Jesse looked up at his mother's face. Kind eyes, premature lines etched by worry and hard work, graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She'd built their entire life around the memory of a heroic husband, found strength in believing his sacrifice had meaning. How could Jesse tell her that the men she trusted, the community she depended on, had murdered the love of her life and covered it up for 10 years? "Ma," he began, then stopped. The words lodged in his throat like stones. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "What is it, sweetheart?" Jesse pulled the old photograph from his pocket, the one he'd carried all these years of his father in uniform. His mother's face softened as she recognized it. "I've been thinking about Pa a lot lately," Jesse said carefully. "About the night he died." Something flickered across his mother's expression, too quick to identify. "Oh, Jesse, you know it doesn't do any good to dwell on. Tell me again what happened. The real story, not the one they tell at church socials." His mother's hand withdrew from his. She stared down at her untouched stew, silent for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your father was a good man, Jesse. Whatever else you might hear, whatever questions people might ask, remember that. He was trying to do the right thing. The careful phrasing sent ice through Jesse's veins. What do you mean, whatever I might hear? Ma, what aren't you telling me? She stood abruptly, turning away to busy herself at the wash basin. Some things are better left buried, son. Your father understood that, in the end. In the end? Jesse's voice cracked. Ma, what really happened to him? His mother's shoulders began to shake. Jesse had seen her cry before, from grief, from exhaustion, from the grinding poverty that followed them like a shadow. But this was different. This was the sound of a woman carrying a weight too heavy for one person to bear. Jesse stood and walked to her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Ma, I know something's wrong. I know the story about the rustlers isn't the whole truth. Please, I'm not a little boy anymore. I can handle whatever it is. She turned to face him then, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. For a moment Jessie thought she was going to tell him everything. The hope in her eyes said she wanted to, that keeping this secret had been slowly killing her for 10 years. Then her expression hardened, and Jesse watched her make the same choice he'd been wrestling with all evening. The choice to protect someone you love from a truth that could destroy them. No, she said firmly, wiping her face with her apron. Some burdens are mine to carry alone. You focus on being young while you still can, Jesse Caldwell. The world has a way of forcing us to grow up soon enough. But as Jesse looked into his mother's eyes, he realized his childhood had already ended. The moment he'd lifted that floorboard in Blackwood Mansion, he'd crossed a line he could never uncross. There was no going back to ignorance, no matter how much easier it might be. The truth was out there, waiting for him to claim it. And despite his fear, despite the danger, despite what it might cost his family, Jesse knew he was going to return to that canyon and find it. That night, Jesse lay in his narrow bed listening to his mother's restless movements in the next room. Every creak of floorboards, every muffled sob that drifted through the thin walls, reminded him that he wasn't the only one carrying secrets. But knowing she was hiding something and having the courage to confront the truth were different beasts entirely. When dawn broke grey and cold over the Montana landscape, Jesse made his decision. He couldn't return to the mansion, not yet, not while those men might still be watching. But there was someone else who might have answers, someone who'd known his father better than anyone except his mother. Old Pete Sanchez lived in a weathered cabin on the far edge of the Caldwell property, where he'd worked as foreman for nearly 30 years. Pete had been his father's closest friend, the man who'd taught Jesse to rope and ride when his mother thought he was too young for such things. If anyone knew the truth about Tom Caldwell's death, it would be Pete. Jesse found the old cowboy mending fence near the dry creek bed, his gnarled hands working with the practiced efficiency of decades. Pete looked up as Jesse approached, his weathered face creasing into the familiar smile that had comforted Jesse through countless childhood scrapes. "Morning, Hijo. You're up early for a boy on summer break." "Pete, I need to ask you something." Jesse dismounted and tied Dust Devil to a fence post. "About my father, about the night he died." The change in Pete's demeanor was immediate and unsettling. The old man's hands stilled on the wire, and his dark eyes grew guarded. "That's a long time ago, Jesse. Why bring up old pain?" "Because I think the pain isn't as old as everyone pretends." Jesse pulled out the photograph he'd taken from the mansion, the one showing his father with the town's leaders. "I found this yesterday. I need to know what it means." Pete's face went ashen as he recognized the image. For a moment, Jesse thought the old foreman might collapse. Instead, Pete carefully set down his tools and gestured for Jesse to follow him away from the ranch house, toward a grove of cottonwoods that would hide them from view. "Where did you find this?" Pete's voice was barely audible. "Does it matter?" "Pete, what were they doing? Why is my father with those men?" Pete was quiet for so long that Jesse began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if each one cost him something precious. "Your father was investigating something, Jesse. Something that went back to the founding of Copper Falls. He'd discovered Irregularities in the land grants, evidence that some of the original claims weren't legitimate. Pete's eyes fixed on the distant mountains, but it was bigger than just paperwork. There were bodies, Jesse, people who deposed the town's founders, people who just disappeared. Jesse's throat went dry. Bodies? A mass grave, hidden on what's now the Cartwright spread. Your father found it while tracking rustlers, real ones that time, dozens of men, women, even children, all buried without ceremony, without record. Pete's voice dropped to a whisper. The founding families built their fortunes on blood, and your father was going to expose them. The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. The photographs weren't evidence of his father's corruption. They were proof of his courage. Tom Caldwell had infiltrated the conspiracy, gathered evidence, prepared to bring justice to Copper Falls. They killed him for it, Jesse said. It wasn't a question. Pete nodded slowly. Made it look like rustlers, just like they'd made other problems disappear over the years. Sheriff Coleman was new then, didn't know enough to ask hard questions. And the men your father was investigating, they controlled the inquest, controlled the narrative. Pete's hands clenched into fists. I wanted to speak up, but I was just a cowhand. Who would have believed me against Mayor Hutchins and Judge Harrison? You could have tried, Jesse said, surprised by the anger in his own voice. And what then? Pete's eyes flashed. You think they would have stopped with your father? Your mother was pregnant with you, Jesse. They made it clear that any inconvenient questions would result in more accidents. I chose to keep your family safe. The weight of 10 years' worth of silence hung between them. Jesse understood now why his mother carried such sadness, why Pete had always looked at him with a mixture of pride and grief. They'd all been living under the shadow of his father's murder, prisoners of their own fear and love. What about the badge? Jesse asked. I found it hidden in the mansion. Pete's eyebrows rose. You went to Blackwood Mansion? Jesse, that place is dangerous. I know. I barely got out alive. Jesse described his encounter with the 3 men, watching Pete's face grow increasingly grim. They know someone's asking questions, Pete said finally. That makes you a threat now, just like your father was. He gripped Jesse's shoulders, his calloused hands surprisingly gentle. You need to be very careful, Hijo. These men have kept their secret for 50 years. They won't hesitate to kill again to protect it. Jesse felt the weight of Pete's warning settle over him like a shroud, but instead of fear, a cold determination began building in his chest. Then what am I supposed to do? Just pretend I never found any of this? Let them get away with murdering my father? That's exactly what you're supposed to do, Pete said firmly. Jesse, you're 12 years old. These aren't schoolyard bullies you can face down with courage and a strong right hook. These are powerful men who've spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. But Jesse was already shaking his head. My father didn't walk away. He could have ignored what he found, could have kept his family safe by staying quiet. But he didn't. And look what happened to him. Pete's voice carried the bitter edge of old grief. Your father was a grown man, a trained lawman with experience and resources. You're a boy with nothing but righteous anger and your father's stubborn streak. The comparison stung because Jesse recognized the truth in it. What could he possibly do against men who controlled the town's government, its courts, its very foundation? But as he touched his father's badge through his shirt, Jesse felt something shift inside him. Not the reckless bravery of youth, but something colder and more calculating. Then I need to get experience. Resources. Jesse met Pete's worried gaze. I need to find out exactly what my father discovered, get proof that even they can't cover up. Pete's face darkened. Jesse, no. I won't let you throw your life away on some fool quest for vengeance. It's not vengeance. The words came out harder than Jesse intended. It's justice. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I stand, they look pretty similar when they both end with you dead in a ditch somewhere. The stark brutality of Pete's words hit Jesse like a physical blow. For a moment, the enormity of what he was contemplating, taking on the most powerful men in Copper Falls, threatened to overwhelm him. But then he thought of his mother's tears last night, of the way she'd carried this secret like a poison in her heart for 10 years. "They're not going to stop," Jesse said quietly. "You said it yourself. They've been killing people for 50 years. How many more will die while we stay quiet and keep our heads down?" Pete's expression softened slightly, and Jesse saw recognition flicker in the old foreman's eyes. "You really are your father's son," Pete murmured. Tom had that same look when he made up his mind about something, like arguing with a mountain. "Will you help me?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither man was sure he wanted to cross. Jesse watched Pete wrestle with the decision, saw the war between loyalty and fear playing out across his weathered features. "If I say no?" Pete asked. "Then I do it alone." Pete cursed softly in Spanish, a string of words that would have earned Jesse a bar of soap if his mother had heard them. "You'll do it alone anyway, won't you? Even if I try to stop you?" Jesse nodded. The certainty in his own voice surprised him. "I have to, Pete. I can't live knowing what I know and doing nothing about it. Your mother will never forgive me if something happens to you. My mother will never forgive herself if we don't try." Pete was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the mountains where the morning sun was burning off the last of the dawn mist. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with resignation and something that might have been pride. "Your father kept files," Pete said finally, "hidden records of what he was investigating. After he died, I took them. Figured they were too dangerous to leave lying around, but too important to destroy." Jesse's pulse quickened. "Where are they?" "Safe. But Jesse, if we do this, if we really go down this road, there's no turning back. Once we start pulling at these threads, the whole fabric of this town is going to come apart. People are going to get hurt. Good people who don't deserve it." Jesse thought of Mayor Hutchins teaching him to whittle, of Judge Harrison's kind words at church functions. Those memories still carried warmth, but now they were tainted with the knowledge of what these men were capable of. The contradiction was almost unbearable, but it was also illuminating. "Maybe that's what's wrong with this place," Jesse said. "Too many good people protecting bad secrets because it's easier than facing the truth." Pete studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, Hijo, but we do this smart. We plan carefully, we move slowly, and we don't take any unnecessary risks. The moment I think you're in over your head, we stop. Agreed?" Jesse extended his hand, and Pete gripped it in his own calloused palm. The handshake felt like a pact, binding them together in something far more dangerous than either man wanted to acknowledge. "Agreed," Jesse said, though they both knew he was lying. The files were hidden in Pete's root cellar, wrapped in oiled cloth and buried beneath sacks of winter potatoes. As Pete handed Jesse the heavy bundle, his weathered hands trembled slightly. Whether from age or fear, Jesse couldn't tell. "Your father started keeping these about 6 months before he died," Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper in the cramped, musty space. He knew someone was watching him, knew they suspected he was getting too close to something they wanted to stay buried. Jesse's fingers fumbled with the cloth wrapping, revealing a collection of documents that looked innocuous enough at first glance. Land deeds, survey maps, newspaper clippings yellowed with age. But as he began to read by lamplight, the true horror of what his father had uncovered became clear. The first document was a letter dated 1847, written in faded ink by someone named Marcus Whitfield. Jesse read aloud, his voice growing steadier with each terrible word. "The miners refuse to abandon their claims despite our generous offers. Clayton believes we can resolve this matter quietly. The territorial authorities are 3 days' ride away and easily convinced that claim jumpers met an unfortunate end." "Keep reading," Pete said grimly. The next papers detailed a systematic campaign of murder and theft that spanned decades. The founding families of Copper Falls, the Claytons, Cartwrights, Hutchins, and Harrisons, hadn't built their fortunes through honest work and good business sense. They'd killed for it, targeting anyone who stood between them and the richest mining claims in the territory. Jesse's hands began to shake as he reached a hand-drawn map in his father's careful script. It showed the location of the mass grave Pete had mentioned, along with detailed notes about the remains found there. 43 bodies, including women and children. Some showed signs of violence. All had been buried without ceremony in a hidden canyon that was now part of the Cartwright ranch. "How did Pa find this?" Jesse whispered. "Started with cattle rustling, like the official story says. But the rustlers your father tracked led him to an old camp in that canyon. When he found the graves, he started digging deeper. Not in the ground, but in the town records, old territorial files, personal letters." Pete's voice was heavy with remembered grief. He was building a case that would have destroyed every powerful family in Copper Falls. Jesse picked up a photograph he hadn't seen before, his father standing beside the mass grave, his face grim but determined. On the back, Tom Caldwell had written, "For Jesse. When you're old enough to understand, know that some truths are worth dying for." The words hit Jesse like a physical blow. His father had known he was in danger, had known he might not survive to see his son grow up. Yet he'd continued his investigation anyway, driven by the same sense of justice that now burned in Jesse's chest. "There's more," Pete said, pulling out a final bundle of papers. "Your father wasn't working alone. He'd contacted the Territorial Marshal's office, sent copies of some evidence to a federal judge in Helena. But look at this." Jesse examined the correspondence, his heart sinking as he read. Every official his father had contacted had either ignored the evidence or sent polite letters explaining why they couldn't pursue the matter. Some had been bought, others had simply chosen not to see what was inconvenient to acknowledge. They had connections everywhere, Jesse said, understanding dawning. "That's how they've gotten away with it for so long." "Your father's last note is the worst part," Pete said, pointing to a letter dated just days before Tom Caldwell's death. Jesse read his father's final words with growing horror. "They know. Coleman warned me tonight that I should be careful and that accidents happen to men who ask too many questions. I've hidden the evidence where they'll never find it, but if something happens to me, I pray someday someone will have the courage to finish what I started." Jesse looked up from the papers, his vision blurring with unshed tears. The full scope of his father's courage and the danger he'd faced was finally clear. Tom Caldwell hadn't just stumbled onto a conspiracy, he'd knowingly walked into a trap, armed with nothing but his badge and his conviction that justice mattered more than safety. "Now you understand," Pete said softly. "This isn't just about your father's murder, Jesse. It's about 50 years of systematic killing, about a town built on blood and lies. The men you're thinking of challenging don't just have money and influence, they have practice at making problems disappear." Jesse carefully rewrapped the documents, his mind racing. The evidence was damning, but Pete was right about one thing. It hadn't been enough to save his father, and it wouldn't be enough to save Jesse if he moved carelessly. But as he climbed out of the root cellar into the bright Montana sunlight, Jesse felt something he hadn't experienced since finding his father's badge. Absolute certainty. The truth was horrible, but it was also powerful. And somewhere in these papers lay the key to bringing down the conspiracy that had murdered his father. The ordeal was just beginning. Jesse spent the rest of the morning poring over his father's files in Pete's cabin, mapping out connections and timelines with the methodical precision of someone far older than his 12 years. The evidence painted a clear picture. The founding families had built their empire on murder, and they'd been systematically eliminating threats ever since. But Jesse was convinced he could succeed where his father had failed. He had the benefit of hindsight, the advantage of knowing who the enemy was, and most importantly, he had nothing left to lose. His plan was simple in its boldness. He would photograph every document, create multiple copies, and distribute them simultaneously to newspapers in Helena, Billings, and Denver. The conspiracy's local influence couldn't reach that far, and the sheer volume of evidence would be impossible to suppress. By the time the founding families realized what was happening, the truth would already be spreading like wildfire across the territory. "I can ride to Helena in 2 days," Jesse told Pete as he carefully organized the documents into logical sequences. "There's a photographer there who can make copies of everything. Once I have enough evidence packages, I can mail them from different towns so they can't trace them back to us." Pete looked increasingly uncomfortable with each detail of the plan. "Jesse, this is moving too fast. We need to think about contingencies, about what happens when they figure out who's behind the leak." "By then it won't matter," Jesse replied with the confidence of youth. "The truth will be out there. They can't kill newspaper editors in 3 different cities without drawing federal attention." But even as Jesse spoke, he felt a nagging unease. The plan was sound in theory, but something about Pete's expression troubled him. The old foreman kept glancing toward the window, his weathered hands fidgeting with his coffee cup in a way that seemed out of character. "Pete, what's wrong?" Jesse asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Pete muttered. Then louder, "Jesse, I think we should wait. Think this through more carefully. Your father rushed into things, and look what happened to him." Jesse was about to argue when he heard the sound of approaching horses, multiple riders coming fast. Through the cabin's window, he saw a cloud of dust rising from the direction of the main ranch buildings. "Hide the files," Pete said urgently, but Jesse was already moving, gathering the precious documents and shoving them back into their oiled cloth wrapping. He had just sealed the bundle when the door burst open without ceremony. Sheriff Coleman stood in the doorway, his badge catching the afternoon light. Behind him were 2 deputies Jesse didn't recognize, their hands resting casually on their gun belts. The sheriff's usually jovial demeanor was nowhere to be seen. Instead, his face wore the cold expression of a man conducting unpleasant but necessary business. Afternoon, Pete Jesse Coleman tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Mind if we come in? Got some questions we'd like to ask." Jesse's mouth went dry, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Questions about what, Sheriff?" "About your recent activities. Seems you've been spending time in places you shouldn't, asking questions that make certain people nervous." Coleman's eyes swept the cabin, taking in every detail. "Now, I'm sure it's all just boyish curiosity, but folks are concerned about your safety. Abandoned buildings can be dangerous places." The message was clear. They knew about the mansion. Jesse's mind raced, trying to calculate how much they suspected and how much they could prove. But as he watched Pete's face, a terrible realization began to dawn. "Pete," Jesse said quietly, "how did you know exactly where my father hid his files?" The old foreman's face crumpled with shame and regret. "Jesse, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. But they have my grandson in Helena. Little Roberto is only 8 years old, and they said—" Pete's voice broke. "They said accidents happen to children too." The betrayal hit Jesse harder than any physical blow. Pete, his father's best friend, the man who'd taught him to ride and rope, had been working for the conspiracy all along. The files, the emotional confessions, the careful planning, all of it had been an elaborate trap designed to draw Jesse into the open and force him to reveal what he knew. "So touching," Coleman said, though his voice held no warmth. "Pete here has been keeping an eye on things for us since your father's unfortunate passing. When you started poking around the mansion, he knew it was time to flush you out." The sheriff gestured to his deputies. "Search the place. I want every document, every photograph, every scrap of paper that mentions the founding families." Jesse clutched the bundle of files against his chest, but he knew it was hopeless. 3 armed men in a one-room cabin left him no room for escape, no clever trick to pull from his sleeve. Everything his father had died to preserve, everything Jesse had hoped to use for justice, was about to disappear into the conspiracy's hands. As the deputies advanced, Jesse felt the last of his childhood innocence crumble away. He was alone, truly alone, with no allies and no hope of rescue. All seemed lost. But as the first deputy reached for the bundle of files, Jesse's desperation sparked an unexpected clarity. His father's final note had mentioned hiding evidence where they'll never find it, yet Pete had known exactly where to look in the root cellar. If Pete had been compromised all along, how could he have known about evidence he wasn't supposed to have access to? The answer hit Jesse like lightning. These weren't his father's real files. "Wait," Jesse said, clutching the documents tighter. "Pete, If you've been working for them since Pa died, how did you know about the root cellar? How did you know where the files were hidden?" Pete's face went ashen, and Coleman's confident smirk faltered slightly. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he studied his old informant with new suspicion. Your father told me," Pete stammered. "Before he died, he said—" "No." Jesse's voice grew stronger as understanding flooded through him. "Pa wouldn't have told you anything if he suspected someone was watching him. He was too careful for that." Jesse looked directly at Coleman, pieces falling into place. "You made these files, didn't you? You created fake evidence to see what I knew, to find out if Pa had told me anything before he died." Coleman's mask of politeness slipped entirely. "Clever boy. Too clever for your own good, just like your father." "But you made a mistake," Jesse continued, his mind racing ahead of his words. "If these are fake, then the real files are still hidden. Pa really did hide them where you'd never find them, and you still don't know what I've discovered on my own." The sheriff's face darkened. "What have you discovered, boy?" Jesse realized he was walking a tightrope over an abyss. One wrong word would reveal that he'd found his father's badge, the photographs, the evidence of the conspiracy's existence. But his revelation about the fake files had given him leverage he hadn't expected. "I know about the mansion," Jesse said carefully. "I know it didn't burn down 50 years ago like everyone claims, and I know there's something there you don't want people to find." Coleman exchanged glances with his deputies, and Jesse saw uncertainty flicker across their faces. They still didn't know the extent of what he'd uncovered, which meant they couldn't simply eliminate him without risking exposure of secrets he might have shared with others. "The mansion is dangerous," Coleman said, his tone shifting to false concern. "Old buildings, unstable foundations. We're just worried about your safety, like you were worried about my father's safety." The words hung in the air like a challenge. For a moment, Jesse thought he'd pushed too far, but then he saw something unexpected in Pete's eyes. Not the shame and fear he'd displayed moments before, but a flicker of the man who'd been his father's closest friend. "Roberto," Pete said quietly, looking at Coleman. "My grandson. You said you had him, but Roberto's been visiting his aunt in California for 2 months. I got a letter from him just yesterday." Coleman's jaw tightened. "Pete, don't do anything foolish." "You played me," Pete continued, his voice growing stronger. "You made me betray Tom's memory, made me set a trap for his boy. And for what? A lie about my own grandson?" Jesse watched the dynamic in the room shift as Pete's realization changed everything. The old foreman stood slowly, his weathered hands clenching into fists, and Jesse saw in him the man who'd once faced down rustlers alongside Tom Caldwell. "The files in the cellar," Jesse said, understanding flooding through him. "Pete, you didn't take them from Pa's hiding place, did you? Coleman gave them to you. He told you they were the real files, and that you needed to use them to draw me out." "That's right, Hijo." Pete's voice carried the weight of terrible understanding, which means Tom's real evidence is still out there somewhere, still hidden where these bastards can't find it. Coleman's hand moved toward his gun, but the cabin was too small for a quick draw with 3 other people in it. The sheriff's confidence was evaporating as his carefully orchestrated plan crumbled around him. "You have no idea what you're meddling with," Coleman said. "This town, these families, they built something important here, something worth protecting. Built on graves," Jesse said, his father's courage flowing through him like a river. "Built on murder and lies. Built on progress," Coleman snapped, his composure finally breaking. "You think those miners would have created anything lasting? They would have stripped the land bare and moved on, leaving nothing but holes in the ground. The founding families created civilization, created order. Sometimes that requires difficult choices." Jesse stared at the sheriff, seeing him clearly for the first time. This wasn't a man who'd been corrupted by power or money. This was someone who genuinely believed that murder was justified in service of his vision of progress. The realization was more chilling than simple greed would have been. "My father discovered the truth," Jesse said, "and you killed him for it." Coleman smiled coldly. "Prove it." but Jesse already knew he would. The tension in Pete's cabin stretched taut as a bowstring, but Jesse felt something shift inside him. Not fear, but the crystalline clarity that comes when all pretense falls away. Coleman's confession hung in the air between them, an admission of guilt wrapped in justification. The sheriff seemed to realize he'd revealed too much, his hand still hovering near his weapon, calculating odds in a space too cramped for clean violence. "You made one critical error, Sheriff," Jesse said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You assumed I was working alone." Coleman's eyes narrowed. "Boy, if you're trying to bluff your way out of this—" "Doc Harrison knows where I am," Jesse continued, the lie flowing smoothly from his lips. "If I don't return by sunset, he's riding to Helena with a full report of everything I've discovered, including what happened in this cabin today." Pete caught Jesse's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding the game. "That's right," the old foreman said, moving slightly to block one deputy's line of sight to Jesse. "Tom taught his boy well. Never investigate alone, never keep secrets to yourself." Jesse saw doubt creep across Coleman's face. The sheriff was a careful man, and careful men didn't survive 50 years of conspiracy by making rash moves when the stakes were unclear. If there was even a chance that Jesse had shared his knowledge with someone beyond their immediate control, elimination became impossibly risky. "Besides," Jesse added, pressing his advantage, "killing Pete's grandson might have been an empty threat, but threatening a 12-year-old boy? Even your founding family friends might find that distasteful, bad for their reputations." Coleman's laugh was bitter. "You have no idea what they'd find acceptable to protect their interests." "Then why are we talking instead of dying?" Jesse asked. "Because you're not sure what I know, what I've shared, or how much noise my disappearance would make. Pa taught me that uncertainty is sometimes the best weapon a man can have." The standoff stretched between them, but Jesse could sense the balance shifting. Coleman needed information more than he needed bodies, at least for now. The sheriff holstered his weapon with deliberate slowness, though his deputies remained tense. "What do you want, boy?" Jesse felt Pete's surprised glance, but he kept his focus on Coleman. This was the moment that would determine everything, not just his own survival, but whether his father's sacrifice would have meaning. "I want the truth about how my father died, not the official story, not some convenient lie about rustlers. I want to hear it from the man who killed him." "That's a dangerous request." "I'm already in danger. We both know I'm not walking away from this knowledge, Sheriff. The only question is whether I get answers before you decide what to do with me." Coleman studied him for a long moment, and Jesse saw something like respect flicker in the man's cold eyes. "Your father said almost the exact same thing, you know. The night before he died, he told me he wouldn't stop digging until he had the whole truth. And that's when you decided he had to die. That's when I realized he was too much like you, too stubborn to understand that some truths are too dangerous to live with." Coleman pulled out a chair and sat down, his posture suggesting a man settling in for a long conversation. "Your father found the graves, just like we suspected he would. But instead of being smart about it, instead of taking the money we offered to relocate his family somewhere comfortable, he wanted justice." Jesse's hands clenched into fists. "Justice for 43 murdered people. Justice for 43 obstacles to progress," Coleman corrected. "Those miners had no vision beyond their own pockets. The founding families saw what this land could become, prosperous, civilized, permanent. Sometimes civilization requires difficult births. You sound like you actually believe that." "I've spent 30 years as sheriff of this town, boy. I've watched it grow from a collection of ramshackle mining camps into something approaching respectability. The founding families didn't just kill for land. They built schools, churches, businesses that employ hundreds of people. Your father would have destroyed all of that for the sake of men dead 50 years. Jesse felt his anger crystallizing into something harder and more focused. "So you murdered him?" "I did what was necessary to protect this community." Coleman's voice carried no remorse, only pragmatic certainty. Tom was building a case that would have brought federal attention, outside investigators, reporters. The scandal would have destroyed not just the founding families, but everyone who depended on them for their livelihoods. Including you. Coleman smiled thinly. Including me. But that wasn't my primary concern. I've always been replaceable. The town isn't. Jesse looked at Pete, seeing his father's old friend struggle with decades of carefully maintained loyalty crumbling around him. The revelation that Coleman had manipulated him with lies about his grandson had shattered something fundamental in the old foreman, and Jesse sensed an ally emerging from betrayal's ashes. "Pete," Jesse said quietly, "will you help me finish what my father started?" The weathered cowboy straightened his shoulders and nodded grimly. "Tell me what you need, Joe." Coleman's deputies shifted uneasily at Pete's declaration of loyalty, but the sheriff himself seemed almost amused by the development. "Pete, you old fool, do you really think helping this boy is going to bring Tom back? Or change what happened to those miners 50 years ago?" "No," Pete said, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "But it might prevent the next murder, might stop the next good man from dying because he believed in doing what's right." Jesse felt the momentum building, but he knew they were still trapped in the cabin with armed men who had nothing left to lose. Coleman's willingness to confess suggested a man preparing to eliminate witnesses, not someone planning to let them walk away. "The real files," Jesse said, his mind racing through possibilities. "Where would Pa have hidden them?" "Somewhere you've already searched." Coleman's expression darkened. "We've torn apart your ranch house, the barn, every line shack and water tank on your property. We've searched his office at the courthouse, his favorite fishing spots, even questioned your mother about places he might have—" "You questioned my mother?" Jesse's voice cracked with fury. "She's been grieving for 10 years, and you made her relive his death to cover your tracks?" "Sarah Caldwell is a strong woman," Coleman said dismissively. "She survived the questioning just fine. Better than she'll survive the truth about what her precious husband was really doing in those final weeks." The casual cruelty in Coleman's tone ignited something primal in Jesse. His father's badge seemed to burn against his chest where he'd hidden it, and he understood with perfect clarity that this man had destroyed his family as casually as he might swat a fly. But with that understanding came strategy. If Coleman had searched everywhere obvious, then his father had been cleverer than any of them realized. Tom Caldwell had known he was being watched, had known his time was running out, and had hidden his evidence somewhere that 30 years of careful searching hadn't uncovered. "You'll never find them," Jesse said with sudden conviction. "Because Pa didn't hide them in a place. He hid them with a person. Someone you'd never suspect, someone who's been right under your nose this whole time." Coleman's confidence flickered. "Who?" Jesse smiled, feeling his father's cunning flow through him like inherited steel. "Doc Harrison, the one man in town you couldn't threaten or buy because he's got more dirt on the founding families than anyone else alive. Every suspicious death, every convenient accident, every time you needed a medical examiner to look the other way. He was there, keeping records." The lie was beautiful in its simplicity, built on just enough truth to be believable. Doc Harrison was indeed the one person in Copper Falls who commanded universal respect, whose word carried weight even with the founding families. If anyone could have safely harbored dangerous evidence, it would be him. "That's impossible," Coleman said, but Jesse heard uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Harrison's been cooperative for decades." "Cooperative because he was gathering evidence," Pete added, catching on to Jesse's deception. "Tom always said the doc was playing a longer game than the rest of us understood." Jesse watched Coleman's face as doubt took root. The sheriff was remembering decades of interactions with Doc Harrison, looking for signs he might have missed, wondering if the town's most trusted citizen had been documenting their crimes all along. "Even if that were true," Coleman said slowly, "it doesn't change your situation. You're still here, still a threat that needs to be contained." "But now you have a bigger problem," Jesse replied. Because if something happens to me, Doc Harrison will know exactly who's responsible, and unlike my father, the doc has connections outside Copper Falls, federal connections from his army days. The cabin fell silent except for the whisper of wind through the walls. Jesse could see Coleman calculating, weighing the risks of action against inaction. The sheriff's carefully controlled world was fracturing around him, and Jesse pressed his advantage. "Here's what's going to happen," Jesse said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even him. "Pete and I are walking out of here. You're going to let us go because you need time to figure out how much damage control you're facing, and I'm going to take some time to decide whether exposing the truth is worth destroying an entire town." "You're bluffing," Coleman said, but his hand didn't move toward his weapon. "Maybe," Jesse admitted. "But are you willing to bet 30 years of careful planning on it?" Pete moved toward the door, his weathered frame blocking one deputy's line of fire. "Come on, Jesse. We've got horses to tend." Jesse stood slowly, the bundle of fake files still clutched in his hands. He looked directly at Coleman, seeing his father's killer with perfect clarity for the first time. "Sheriff," Jesse said quietly, "the next time we meet, one of us won't be walking away." Then he followed Pete toward the door, toward whatever consequences awaited beyond the cabin's walls. The afternoon sun felt like salvation on Jesse's face as he and Pete emerged from the cabin, but he knew their freedom was fragile as morning frost. Coleman's voice drifted through the open door behind them, low and urgent as he spoke to his deputies. Jesse couldn't make out the words, but the tone promised swift and violent action. "Walk steady, Hijo," Pete murmured, heading toward the corral where their horses waited. "Don't look back, don't run. Men like Coleman smell fear like wolves smell blood." Jesse's legs wanted to betray him, to break into a panicked sprint toward his horse, but his father's training held firm. Tom Caldwell had taught him that a man's gait revealed his intentions, that confident movement could be armor against those who sought weakness. So Jesse walked with deliberate purpose, even as his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird. They reached the horses without gunfire erupting behind them, but Jesse knew the reprieve was temporary. His lies about Doc Harrison had bought them minutes, maybe an hour before Coleman realized the deception. The sheriff would send riders to question the doctor, would discover that Jesse had been bluffing about shared evidence and federal connections, and then the hunt would begin in earnest. "Where can we go?" Jesse asked as they mounted up. "Coleman controls the sheriff's department, and half the town council answers to the founding families. There's nowhere in Copper Falls we'd be safe." Pete's weathered face was grim as he guided his horse away from the cabin. "Then we don't stay in Copper Falls. Your pa had contingency plans, Jesse. He knew this day might come." "What kind of plans?" "He never told me specifics, but Tom mentioned a friend in Helena, someone from his army days who'd gone into federal law enforcement. Said if things ever went sideways with the local corruption, this friend would listen to the truth." Jesse felt a flicker of hope kindle in his chest. His father had been planning for this confrontation even 10 years ago, had seen the collision coming and prepared for it. "Do you know how to contact this friend?" Tom kept the information hidden with his other important papers, the real ones, not the fake files Coleman fed us. Pete urged his horse into a faster pace as they put distance between themselves and the cabin. "But first we need those papers, and I think I know where your father would have hidden them." They rode hard across the rangeland, Jesse's mind racing faster than his horse's hooves. Everything his father had taught him about investigation, about following evidence and building cases, had been preparation for this moment. Tom Caldwell had known his son might someday need to finish what he started, and every lesson had been both education and inheritance. The Blackwood mansion rose from the canyon like a Gothic accusation against the sky. Jesse felt the familiar chill as they approached, but this time the sensation carried anticipation rather than pure dread. The mansion had given up its first secrets, his father's badge, the photographs of the conspiracy's membership. But Pete was right. There would be more. Tom Caldwell had been too thorough to hide evidence in just one location. "Your pa brought me here once," Pete said, as they dismounted near the mansion's imposing entrance. "About a month before he died. Wouldn't tell me why, just said he needed a witness to see something important. Now I'm thinking he wanted me to know where to find his insurance policy. They entered the mansion together, their footsteps echoing through rooms that seemed frozen in time. Jesse led Pete to the parlor where he'd discovered the loose floorboard, but the old foreman shook his head. Too obvious. Tom was cleverer than that. Pete studied the room with calculating eyes. He taught you to think like the evidence, didn't he? To put yourself in the mind of someone trying to hide something that absolutely couldn't be found. Jesse nodded, remembering his father's voice. Think like the secret, boy. What does it want? Where does it feel safe? The photographs showed all the founding family's patriarchs, Jesse said slowly. But there were other people in some of those pictures. Servants, maybe, or workers. People who would have seen things but been ignored. The mansion's staff quarters, Pete said with sudden understanding. They wouldn't have burned with the main house because they were separate buildings, and nobody would think to search them because officially this place has been ruins for 50 years. They found the servants' quarters behind the main house, a row of small stone buildings that had weathered decades better than anyone might have expected. The third building's door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for them. Inside, beneath a loose stone in what had once been a fireplace, Jesse's fingers found oiled leather wrapped around a thick bundle of papers. His hands trembled as he opened his father's real files. Photographs, documents, witness statements from people long dead, and a detailed map showing the exact location of the miner's mass grave. But most importantly, a letter addressed to U.S. Marshal Frank Delaney in Helena, complete with contact information and detailed instructions for pursuing federal investigation of the conspiracy. Your father was building a fortress of truth, Pete said softly. Every piece of evidence designed to support the others, to create a case so strong that even powerful men couldn't tear it down. Jesse looked up from the papers, hearing distant hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. Coleman had discovered their deception faster than expected. The final test was beginning, and everything would depend on whether Jesse could finish what his father had died to start. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Jesse clutched his father's files against his chest as Pete peered through the cracked window of the servants' quarters. 4 riders, Pete whispered. Coleman's brought backup. Jesse's mind raced through possibilities. They were trapped in the canyon with only one way out, and Coleman controlled that exit. But his father's voice echoed in his memory. When you're cornered, boy, sometimes the only way through is straight ahead. We can't outrun them, Jesse said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. But we don't have to. He pulled his father's badge from beneath his shirt, the metal catching what little light filtered through the dusty window. 10 years of questions, 10 years of half-truths and carefully constructed lies, all leading to this moment. The weight of the badge felt different now, not just a memento of loss, but a symbol of unfinished justice. Pete, take the files and get to Helena. Find Marshal Delaney. The old foreman's weathered face hardened with resolve. I'm not leaving you to face Coleman alone, Hijo. Someone has to survive this. Someone has to make sure Pa's work wasn't for nothing. Jesse looked toward the mansion's looming silhouette. Besides, I won't be alone. This place has been keeping secrets for 50 years. Time to see if it'll keep one more. The sound of boots on stone echoed from the main house. Coleman had arrived, and he wasn't bothering with subtlety anymore. Jesse heard the sheriff's voice carrying across the courtyard, sharp with authority and barely controlled rage. Jesse Caldwell, I know you're here. Time to stop playing games. Jesse pressed the files into Pete's hands. There's an old mine shaft about a quarter-mile north of here. Pa showed it to me once, said it connected to a whole network of abandoned tunnels. You can get out without them seeing you. Pete's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Your father would be proud of you, boy. Prouder than you know. Then make sure his sacrifice matters. Jesse slipped from the servants' quarters as Pete disappeared into the gathering shadows, heading for the escape route that would carry Tom Caldwell's evidence toward justice at last. The mansion's front door stood open, spilling golden afternoon light across the threshold like an invitation. Coleman waited in the parlor where this all began, his weapon drawn but pointed toward the floor. Two deputies flanked him, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they'd come to do. The sheriff's composure had cracked during the ride to the mansion, revealing the desperate man beneath decades of careful control. "Where's Pete?" Coleman demanded. "Gone," Jesse said simply, "along with everything you've spent 30 years trying to hide." Coleman's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "You think sending an old cowboy with a handful of papers is going to bring down families that built this territory? Boy, you understand even less than your father did." "I understand enough." Jesse stepped into the parlor, his father's badge visible against his shirt. "I understand you murdered a good man to protect a lie. I understand you've spent 10 years manipulating my mother, feeding her false stories about how her husband died. And I understand you're scared." "Scared?" Coleman's voice cracked with incredulous rage. "Of a 12-year-old boy. Of the truth finally coming out. Of federal investigators asking questions you can't answer. Of losing everything you've built on blood and secrets." Jesse moved deeper into the room, drawing Coleman's attention away from the windows, away from any glimpse of Pete's escape. "You're terrified that Pa was right, that some things matter more than money and power and reputation." Coleman raised his weapon, the barrel trembling slightly with suppressed fury. "Your father thought justice was more important than consequences. Look where it got him." "It got him here," Jesse said, gesturing toward the mansion's preserved grandeur. "Standing up to men who think murder is just another business transaction, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves. That's not something to regret, Sheriff. That's something to be proud of." The confession came like a physical blow. Coleman's careful mask finally shattered completely, revealing decades of justified atrocity beneath. "I put 3 bullets in your father's chest and watched him die in this very room," Coleman snarled. "He kept asking about you, about whether you'd grow up knowing the truth. I told him you'd never know anything except the official story. Seems I was wrong." Jesse felt his father's presence like warmth against his back, steadying him for what came next. The badge grew heavy against his chest, carrying the weight of legacy and responsibility and love that transcended death itself. "Yeah," Jesse said quietly, his hand moving toward the loose floorboard where he'd first found hope. "You were wrong about a lot of things." The hidden derringer his father had left beneath the floorboards felt cold and certain in his palm. Tom Caldwell's final gift to his son, not just evidence of conspiracy, but the means to finish what justice demanded. The confrontation that had been building for 10 years was finally here. The derringer was smaller than Jesse had imagined, fitting in his palm like a deadly promise. His father's final lesson: sometimes justice required more than evidence and truth. Sometimes it demanded action that could never be undone. Coleman's eyes tracked the movement of Jesse's hand. The sheriff's own weapon, steadying as professional instinct, took control. "Put it down, boy. You're not a killer." "Neither was my father," Jesse replied, his thumb finding the derringer's hammer. "But you made him into something else when you murdered him in cold blood." The parlor fell silent, except for the whisper of wind through broken shutters. Jesse could feel the weight of the moment pressing down like storm clouds, heavy with the promise of violence that would change everything. This was the choice his father had never wanted him to face, the terrible mathematics of justice when law and order had been corrupted beyond redemption. "You pull that trigger, you become just like me," Coleman said, his voice carrying false calm. "Is that what Tom Caldwell would want for his son?" Jesse's hand trembled slightly, the derringer's weight seeming to increase with each heartbeat. His father's voice echoed in memory, lessons about right and wrong, about the responsibility that came with wearing a badge and carrying the law's authority. Tom Caldwell had believed in justice through proper channels, through evidence and due process and faith in institutions. But those institutions had failed. Worse than failed, they had been corrupted from within, twisted into weapons against the very people they were meant to protect. The sheriff's badge on Coleman's chest was a mockery of everything Jesse's father had died defending. "He'd want justice," Jesse said finally. He'd want the truth to matter more than the consequences. Coleman shifted his weight, preparing to fire. "Then you understand why I can't let you leave here alive." The gunshot echoed through the mansion like thunder, but it wasn't Jesse who fired first. The derringer remained steady in his grip as Coleman staggered backward, crimson spreading across his shirt. Behind the sheriff, Deputy Marshal Frank Delaney stepped through the mansion's rear entrance, his federal badge gleaming in the afternoon light. "Pete made good time," Delaney said calmly, his weapon trained on Coleman's remaining deputies. "Federal marshals can cover ground faster than local law when properly motivated." Coleman's weapon clattered to the floor as he pressed his hand against the spreading wound. This won't stand. You have no jurisdiction here." "Murder of a federal officer investigating territorial corruption gives me all the jurisdiction I need," Delaney replied. "Your friend Pete delivered quite a collection of evidence, enough to hang half the founding families and put the rest in federal prison for life." Jesse lowered the derringer, his hand shaking now that the moment had passed. He had been prepared to pull the trigger, prepared to become something his father never wanted him to be. The weight of that near choice settled in his chest like lead. "Your father saved you from that burden," Delaney said quietly, understanding Jesse's expression. "Tom Caldwell knew this day would come. He made me promise to watch over his investigation from a distance, to step in if things went too far. He never wanted you to carry the weight of killing, even justified killing." Coleman slumped against the parlor wall, his face pale but defiant. You think this ends anything? The families have connections in Washington, money that reaches federal judges. They'll walk free inside a year." "Maybe," Delaney admitted. "But the miners will finally get proper burial. The truth will be on public record, and everyone will know what Tom Caldwell died trying to expose. Sometimes that's as much justice as we get." Jesse looked down at the derringer in his palm, understanding finally what his father had truly left him. Not just the means for revenge, but the choice between justice and vengeance. Tom Caldwell had trusted his son to make the right decision, even when that decision came with terrible cost. The cost was forgiveness, not of Coleman's crimes, but of Jesse's own burning need to personally exact retribution. Justice through proper channels, even federal channels, meant letting others decide Coleman's fate. It meant trusting institutions his father had died defending despite their previous failure. "What happens now?" Jesse asked, sliding the derringer into his pocket. "Now you go home to your mother," Delaney said. "Tell her the truth about how her husband died. Help her understand that Tom Caldwell's sacrifice meant something." Jesse nodded, feeling the weight of his father's badge against his chest. He would carry the truth forward, would ensure the story was told properly. But he would also carry the knowledge that justice sometimes demanded restraint as much as action. The mansion's shadows seemed lighter as federal deputies led Coleman away. 50 years of secrets were finally emerging into sunlight, and the dead could rest at last. Jesse had won, but victory tasted different than he'd expected, bittersweet with the knowledge that some wounds could never fully heal. His father's work was finished. Now Jesse's real life could begin. The resolution. The ride home from Blackwood Mansion felt longer than Jesse remembered, though the late afternoon sun painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold that should have been beautiful. Marshal Delaney rode beside him in comfortable silence, understanding that some moments required quiet reflection rather than conversation. Behind them, a federal wagon carried Coleman and the corrupted deputies toward justice that had been 10 years in the making. Jesse's hand kept moving to his father's badge beneath his shirt, the metal warm now from body heat and afternoon sun. The weight felt different than it had that morning, less like a burden of unanswered questions, more like a compass pointing toward whatever came next. His father's work was finished, but Tom Caldwell's lessons would continue echoing through his son's choices for years to come. "You're thinking loud enough to spook the horses," Delaney said finally, his weathered face creasing with something that might have been a smile. "Just trying to figure out what I tell Ma," Jesse replied. 10 years of believing one story, and now everything's different. Truth usually is different than comfortable lies, doesn't make it less necessary. They crested the hill overlooking the Caldwell ranch, and Jesse saw his mother standing on the front porch, shading her eyes against the setting sun as she watched them approach. She'd been waiting there since Pete had ridden through that morning with news that federal marshals were finally coming to Copper Falls, waiting for answers she'd been denied for a decade. Elena Caldwell's face showed no surprise when she saw the federal badge on Delaney's chest, no shock when the marshal quietly explained that her husband had been murdered rather than killed by rustlers. Instead, she listened with the composed strength of a woman who had always suspected the official story carried gaps too large to ignore. "I knew Tom wasn't telling me everything those last few months," she said when Delaney finished his explanation. "He'd get this look when he thought I wasn't watching, like he was carrying weight too heavy for one man. I should have pushed him to trust me with the truth." "Tom was protecting you the only way he knew how," Delaney replied gently. "Men like Coleman don't hesitate to threaten families when they feel cornered. Your husband kept you safe by keeping you ignorant." Jesse watched his mother's face process the revelation that their entire life in Copper Falls had been built on carefully constructed deception. The friends she'd trusted, the community leaders she'd respected, even the sheriff who'd comforted her after Tom's funeral, all of them complicit in her husband's murder. "What happens to the town now?" Elena asked. "Federal investigation will take months, maybe years," Delaney said. "Trials for everyone involved in the conspiracy. The founding families will fight with expensive lawyers and political connections, but the evidence your husband gathered is thorough enough to ensure convictions. Some of them, anyway." Jesse found himself thinking about Sarah Coleman, wondering how she would handle learning that her father was a murderer, about the other children in town whose families would be destroyed by truth that could no longer be contained. The justice his father had died seeking would ripple outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that would touch innocent lives. "We can't stay here," his mother said quietly, voicing the reality Jesse had been avoiding. "This town will never forgive us for bringing their secrets into sunlight." "Tom expected that," Delaney replied. "He made arrangements. There's a ranch outside Helena, good land with water rights already secured, federal witness protection until the trials are finished, then a new life wherever you choose to build it." Jesse felt a strange mixture of relief and loss. Leaving Copper Falls meant abandoning everything familiar, but it also meant escaping the weight of being Tom Caldwell's son in a place where that name would forever carry the burden of unwelcome truth. "The miners will finally get proper burial," Delaney continued. "Federal funds for a memorial, their names carved in stone so they're not forgotten again. Your father's investigation made that possible." Elena Caldwell reached for her son's hand, her fingers finding his with the certainty of shared grief and shared hope. "Tom always said justice was worth whatever it cost. I never understood what he meant until now." Jesse squeezed his mother's fingers, feeling the last pieces of his childhood settle into place. The boy who had discovered his father's badge beneath the mansion's floorboards was gone, replaced by someone who understood that growing up meant accepting responsibility for difficult truths. Marshal Delaney mounted his horse as the sun touched the horizon, preparing to ride back to Copper Falls and the work of dismantling 50 years of carefully maintained lies. "Your father would be proud, Jesse. He trusted you to finish what he started, and you didn't let him down." Jesse nodded, his throat tight with emotions too complex for words. The mansion's shadows were behind him now, its secrets finally released into daylight where they belonged. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new tests of the lessons Tom Caldwell had spent 12 years teaching his son. But tonight, for the first time in a decade, Jesse Caldwell could sleep without wondering what really happened to his father. The first morning in 10 years began differently. Jesse woke to silence, not the oppressive quiet of unanswered questions that had haunted his sleep since childhood, but the peaceful stillness of a world finally set right. Sunlight streamed through his bedroom window, carrying warmth that seemed to reach deeper than his skin, touching places inside him that had been cold for as long as he could remember. His father's badge lay on the nightstand where he'd placed it before sleep, the metal catching morning light like a promise kept. Jesse picked it up, running his thumb across the worn surface, feeling the weight of legacy without the crushing burden of mystery. Tom Caldwell's work was done. His son's was just beginning. Downstairs, his mother stood at the kitchen window, watching the sunrise paint their land in shades of gold and copper. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and Jesse saw something in her face he'd almost forgotten: peace. The tight lines around her eyes had softened during the night, as if a decade of tension had finally released its hold. "You look different," she said, studying him with a mother's careful attention. "Feel different," Jesse replied, though he struggled to put the change into words. The boy who had crawled through the mansion's shadows, driven by desperate need for answers, seemed like a stranger now. In his place stood someone who understood that truth, once found, demanded action, that justice required courage, that growing up meant accepting responsibility for choices that would echo long after childhood ended. Elena Caldwell smiled, the expression reaching her eyes for the first time in years. "Your father used to say that knowing the right thing and doing it were two different kinds of courage. You have both now." They ate breakfast in comfortable companionship, making quiet plans for the move to Helena, for the new life that waited beyond Copper Falls' shadow. Jesse found himself thinking not about what they were leaving behind, but what they were moving toward, a place where his father's name would carry honor instead of whispered controversy, where they could build something clean and true. Pete arrived as they finished packing, his weathered face creased with satisfaction, and something that might have been pride. "Federal marshals rounded up the last of them this morning," he reported. "Judge Hartwell tried to run for the territorial border, but Delaney's men were waiting. Even had old banker Morrison crying like a child when they read the charges." Jesse felt no satisfaction in their capture, only the quiet certainty that justice was finally taking its proper course. The boy who had wanted personal revenge was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some victories belonged to larger forces than individual anger. "What about you, Pete?" Elena asked. "Will you stay in Copper Falls?" The old cowboy shook his head. "Nothing left for me there. Town's going to tear itself apart during the trials, and I'm too old for that kind of fighting. Thought I might head south, maybe find work on a ranch that doesn't sit on buried secrets." Jesse reached into his pocket, pulling out the small leather journal his father had hidden beneath the mansion's floorboards. "Pa would want you to have this. His thoughts about ranching, about reading the land. You taught him most of what's written there." Pete accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly, understanding the weight of the gift. "Tom Caldwell was the best man I ever knew. You're going to be just like him, boy. Maybe even better." As Pete rode away, Jesse felt the last connection to his old life fade into distance. The friends he'd grown up with would learn terrible truths about their families. The town that had shaped his childhood would never recover from the exposure of its foundational lies. But for the first time, Jesse understood that he wasn't responsible for fixing everyone's pain, only for carrying his father's lessons forward with honor. The wagon arrived at noon, loaded with their possessions and driven by a federal deputy who would escort them to their new home. Jesse took one last look at the land his father had loved, memorizing the way afternoon light played across familiar pastures. This place would always be part of him, but it no longer defined him. His mother climbed onto the wagon seat, her face serene with the knowledge that they were finally free to live without secrets. Jesse followed, settling beside her as the deputy urged the horses into motion. The Caldwell ranch disappeared behind them, taking with it the boy who had searched desperately for truth in forbidden places. In his pocket, Tom Caldwell's badge rested against Jesse's leg, no longer a mystery to be solved, but a compass for choices yet to come. The Derringer was gone, turned over to Marshal Delaney as evidence, but Jesse carried something far more valuable, the understanding that courage meant protecting the innocent, that justice was worth any personal cost, and that a man's true legacy lived in the principles he passed to his children. As Montana landscape rolled past in endless waves of gold and green, Jesse Caldwell began planning the man he would become. The new beginning. 2 years later, Jesse Caldwell stood in the doorway of the Helena schoolhouse, watching younger children struggle with their arithmetic while he waited for the teacher to dismiss them. At 14, he was too old for most of the lessons, but Mrs. Patterson had agreed to tutor him in law and government, subjects that had become increasingly important as the Copper Falls trials continued to wind through federal courts. The boy who had crawled through Blackwood Mansion's shadows was gone, replaced by a young man whose eyes held depths that surprised adults. Jesse had grown taller, his shoulders broader from ranch work, but the real changes ran deeper than physical development. He carried himself with quiet confidence, spoke carefully and listened more, understood that words carried weight that could build or destroy. Their new ranch outside Helena had prospered beyond his mother's cautious hopes. The land was good, the water rights secure, and Jesse had discovered he possessed his father's instinctive understanding of cattle and weather patterns. More importantly, he'd learned to trust his own judgment, to make decisions based on principle rather than fear or anger. "Your essay on territorial justice was exceptional," Mrs. Patterson said as she gathered her papers. "You write like someone who's lived the concepts rather than just studied them." Jesse nodded politely, though her words stirred complex emotions. The trials in Copper Falls had dominated territorial newspapers for months, each revelation adding new layers to the scandal that had destroyed an entire town's foundation. Coleman had been sentenced to hang, Judge Hartwell to life imprisonment, the banker Morrison to 20 years in federal prison. The founding families had lost everything: land, money, reputation, some of them their freedom. Justice had been served, but victory felt more complicated than the boy in him had expected. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "when doing the right thing hurts innocent people, how do you know it was still right?" Mrs. Patterson studied him with the attention she reserved for her most promising students. "You're thinking about the children in Copper Falls, the families destroyed by exposure of their parents' crimes." "Yes, ma'am. Sometimes I wonder if keeping the secret might have been kinder." "Kindness and justice aren't always the same thing, Jesse. Your father understood that. The miners who died deserved truth, deserved recognition. The people living on stolen land deserved to know the real foundation of their prosperity. Protecting comfortable lies might feel kind, but it usually serves the guilty more than the innocent." Jesse walked home through Helena's bustling streets, past shops and offices where his family name carried no weight of controversy or whispered speculation. Here, Tom Caldwell was remembered only as a lawman who had died seeking justice, a story both simple and true. Jesse found peace in that anonymity, freedom to become whoever he chose, rather than living forever in the shadow of his father's investigation. His mother was waiting on their front porch, a letter in her hands and an expression of carefully controlled emotion on her face. Jesse recognized the federal seal immediately, understanding that news from Copper Falls still had power to disturb their carefully built tranquility. "Marshal Delaney writes that they've finished the memorial," she said, offering him the letter. 37 names carved in granite, with a marker explaining how they died. "Your father's name is there too, recognizing his role in bringing them justice." Jesse read Delaney's careful script, seeing between the lines to truths the marshal was too diplomatic to state directly. Copper Falls was dying, its population scattered, its economy collapsed, the town itself becoming another kind of grave marker. Justice had been served, but entire communities had paid prices that extended far beyond the guilty. "Do you ever regret it?" Jesse asked quietly. "Everything that came from Pa's investigation?" Elena Caldwell was silent for a long moment, watching evening light fade across their peaceful valley. "I regret that good people suffered. I regret that children lost parents, that families were destroyed, that a whole town died from exposure of its secrets. But I don't regret the truth, Jesse. Your father believed that foundations built on lies eventually collapse anyway, usually crushing the innocent along with the guilty. At least this way, the miners finally got recognition. At least the truth is part of the historical record. Jesse folded the letter carefully, understanding that some wounds would never fully heal, but some victories were worth their cost. His father's badge rested in a place of honor on their mantelpiece now, no longer hidden but not ostentatiously displayed, a reminder of principles worth defending, choices worth making, costs worth paying. The boy who had searched desperately for answers in forbidden places was gone forever. In his place stood a young man who understood that truth, once discovered, demanded action, that justice required courage, that growing up meant accepting responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond personal satisfaction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the lessons Tom Caldwell had spent 12 years teaching his son. Jesse was ready for them. The foundation his father had built, not of secrets and lies, but of honor and principle, would support whatever man Jesse chose to become. As Montana's stars emerged in darkening sky, Jesse Caldwell planned his future with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the hardest lessons early and emerged stronger for the learning. His father's work was finished, his own was just beginning.